Thomas Wellington stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching Seattle's rain paint gray streaks across the glass. At 38 years old, he had everything the world admired. A technology empire worth billions, a mansion overlooking Puget Sound, influence that moved markets. Yet inside he remained hollow. Rebecca had been gone for 2 years, taken by a sudden aneurysm that gave no warnings, no goodbyes. Since that terrible morning, Thomas had transformed into someone even he barely recognized. His warm smile had hardened into a permanent mask of professional distance. His employees whispered that he had become a machine, calculating and cold, a mother's desperate plan. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Victoria Wellington, his mother, needed to see him immediately at Providence Medical Center. Thomas arrived to find her looking frailer than ever, her once vibrant presence reduced by terminal cancer. The doctors had given her 3 months, perhaps 4 if she remained fortunate. Victoria wasted no time with pleasantries. She told him plainly that she had changed her will. The controlling shares of Wellington Technologies would only pass to him if he married and demonstrated stable family commitment. Otherwise, everything would transfer to Vincent Shaw, his business partner who had been circling like a predator for years. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest. He reminded his mother that she could not manipulate his life this way. Rebecca had been his everything, his North Star. The thought of replacing her felt like betrayal. Victoria reached for his hand with trembling fingers. She told him she was not asking him to replace Rebecca. She simply wanted him to stop punishing himself by refusing to live fully. She wanted him to understand that love could exist more than once in a lifetime, that his heart was not a tomb. The voice therapist. That same afternoon, Victoria introduced him to Natalia Brooks. She worked at the medical center as a voice therapist, helping stroke patients and others recover their ability to speak. Thomas noticed everything about her in those first seconds. She stood at average height with dark chestnut hair pulled back practically. Her brown eyes held depth that suggested she understood suffering. She wore simple scrubs and minimal jewelry, nothing that demanded attention. Yet something in her quiet presence made him pause. Victoria explained that she had come to know Natalia over the past 6 months during therapy sessions. She described her as having a genuinely good heart, someone who understood sacrifice without expecting recognition. Victoria revealed her proposal. Natalia needed financial stability to keep her twin brothers from entering foster care after their parents died. Thomas needed a wife to satisfy the board and secure his inheritance. This arrangement could benefit everyone involved. Terms of agreement. The suggestion felt absurd to Thomas. He started to object, but Natalia spoke first. She thanked Victoria for the offer, but stated clearly that she could not agree to something so significant. It would not feel right. Victoria pressed forward, explaining that Natalia would help preserve his father's legacy while he provided security for her family. She asked Natalia to consider what this meant for her brothers, Mason and Oliver. Thomas watched emotions flicker across Natalia's face. He recognized the weight of responsibility, the exhausting mathematics of sacrifice. She asked for time to think. Victoria gave her until morning. That night, Thomas sat alone in his study staring at Rebecca's photograph. He whispered apologies to her image, explaining that he needed to protect the company his father built. He was not betraying her memory. He was simply being practical. The decision Natalia returned the next morning with her answer. She would accept the arrangement, but she had specific conditions. Thomas stood, his expression carefully neutral as he asked what she wanted. She stated that Mason and Oliver would attend the best schools without working multiple jobs. They would have opportunities she never received. After 1 year, they would dissolve the marriage quietly. She wanted nothing for herself, beyond what her brothers needed. Thomas studied her carefully, searching for hidden motives or deception. He found only tired determination and fierce protective love. He agreed to her terms. They would create a detailed contract. This would remain purely business, nothing emotional. Natalia met his gaze directly and agreed, though he noticed something almost like disappointment flash briefly in her eyes. The wedding, 3 weeks later, they stood in a small courthouse with gray walls and fluorescent lighting. Victoria attended despite her weakness, supported by a nurse. No flowers decorated the space. No music played. No guests witnessed except for two court-required strangers. Natalia wore a modest cream dress that her brothers helped her choose. Thomas wore his standard business suit, the same he might wear to any corporate meeting. The ceremony lasted 8 minutes. The judge spoke words about commitment and partnership that felt hollow given their arrangement. When asked if he took Natalia as his wife, Thomas responded affirmatively in the same tone he used for conference calls. When the judge pronounced them married, Thomas extended his hand for a formal handshake rather than a kiss. Natalia accepted it, and he felt the warmth of her palm against his, so different from the coldness he had cultivated inside himself. First night at Wellington Estate. That evening, Natalia arrived at the Wellington Estate with 2 suitcases containing everything she owned. The mansion sprawled across 3 acres of manicured grounds with views of Elliott Bay. The housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, showed her to a guest suite in the East Wing, far from where Thomas slept. Mrs. Patterson explained that Mr. Wellington thought she would prefer private space. The bedroom alone exceeded the size of her previous apartment, decorated in soft neutrals that felt expensive but impersonal. Dinner was served in the formal dining room at a table designed for entertaining dozens. Natalia sat at one end, Thomas at the opposite, with an expanse of polished mahogany between them. The meal was prepared by a private chef, each course perfectly executed, yet Natalia tasted nothing. Thomas spoke first, establishing rules. They would maintain separate existences. She could use the house and grounds freely, but his private office and West Wing remained restricted. They would appear together at required social events, but otherwise need not pretend. Natalia set down her fork and asked what exactly this arrangement was. Thomas finally looked at her directly. A temporary solution to complex problems, he answered. She should not mistake this for anything romantic. He had experienced his great love already. He was not seeking another. His words carried more edge than necessary, as if he needed to convince himself as much as her. Natalia straightened her spine and told him she understood perfectly. She had entered this with complete awareness. She held no illusions. They finished eating in silence, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Afterward, Natalia retreated to her room and stood at the window, watching city lights twinkle across the water. She wondered what she had agreed to. This beautiful house felt more like a museum, cold and empty despite its grandeur. Meanwhile, Thomas sat alone in darkness, holding Rebecca's photograph, whispering apologies and explanations to someone who could no longer hear him. 4 weeks had passed since Natalia became Mrs. Wellington in name only. She had established a careful routine that kept her path from crossing Thomas's too frequently. Her mornings began with breakfast alone in the sunroom, followed by volunteer. Work at the medical center where she continued helping patients find their voices again. Afternoons were spent with Mason and Oliver at their new private school, helping them adjust to classmates whose families owned vacation homes and sailboats. Evenings found her retreating to her suite, reading or listening to music through headphones. Mrs. Patterson had gradually warmed to her presence after Natalia insisted on preparing her own coffee and organizing the chaotic spice cabinet. The chef, Bernard, appreciated her genuine compliments about his cooking, yet the rest of the staff maintained professional distance, clearly uncertain about this sudden wife who appeared from nowhere and occupied a guest room rather than the master suite. Natalia understood their confusion. She felt it herself every time someone called her Mrs. Wellington. One Thursday afternoon, Thomas left early for meetings in San Francisco. Natalia found herself wandering through halls she had not yet explored. The West Wing drew her forward despite knowing Thomas had declared it forbidden territory. Her curiosity mixed with growing frustration at being treated like a temporary visitor in what was supposedly her home. The hallway stretched before her, walls covered with photographs documenting Thomas's life in careful chronology. Rebecca's shadow. The early pictures showed a younger Thomas with his father, both wearing hard hats at construction sites, grinning with pride. College graduation photos came next, then images from technology conferences and charity events. Thomas looked different in these older photographs. His smile reached his eyes. His posture suggested openness rather than the defensive. Walls he maintained now. Then came the photos of Rebecca, and Natalia understood everything. Rebecca Wellington had possessed the kind of beauty that seemed almost unfair. Golden hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders. Her green eyes sparkled with intelligence and warmth. In every photograph, she looked at Thomas with obvious adoration, and he returned that gaze with complete devotion. One large portrait dominated the wall. Rebecca wore an emerald silk gown that matched her eyes. Thomas stood beside her in a tuxedo, his hand resting protectively on her waist. The love captured in that frozen moment felt so powerful that Natalia felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred. A voice spoke behind her, making her heart jump. Thomas stood in the hallway, his suit jacket draped over one arm, his tie loosened. His expression remained unreadable, but tension radiated from him. He stated simply that Rebecca had been everything. Natalia turned quickly, apologies tumbling from her lips. She should not have come here. She was merely curious about the house. Thomas moved closer, stopping beside her to study the portrait. Himself. First real conversation, he told Natalia that Rebecca was a pediatric surgeon who volunteered at free clinics. She played piano beautifully and laughed at terrible jokes. She made him believe he could be better than he was. They had been married for 8 years when the aneurysm took her. One moment she was discussing plans for dinner, the next she collapsed. She died before the ambulance arrived. He held her and felt her life slip away while being completely powerless to stop it. Natalia listened, recognizing the raw grief that still controlled him. She said quietly that losing someone that way must feel unbearable, like the world betrayed fundamental rules. Thomas looked at her with surprise, as if he had not expected understanding. He asked if she had lost someone. Natalia explained that her parents died in a car accident when she was 22. A drunk driver crossed the median on Interstate 5. Mason and Oliver were only 12 then, just children who suddenly had no one except their older sister. She became their guardian, their parent, their entire security. She understood about loving someone so completely that losing them left you fundamentally changed. For several minutes, they stood together in that hallway, two strangers bound by legal contract but connected by shared understanding of loss. Thomas finally spoke, his voice softer than she had heard before. He asked if she ever felt angry about it. Natalia admitted she felt furious sometimes, angry at the drunk driver, at fate, at God if he existed, angry that her parents missed watching their sons grow up, angry that she had to sacrifice her own dreams to provide stability. Then she felt guilty for the anger because she loved Mason and Oliver desperately. The garden sanctuary, Thomas nodded slowly, something easing in his rigid posture. He told her she could explore anywhere in the house. The West Wing was not truly forbidden. He simply found it difficult when others disturbed these spaces. Natalia thanked him and turned to leave, but Thomas stopped her. He asked what dreams she had sacrificed. She paused, debating how much to reveal. Finally, she told him she had planned to study music therapy professionally, perhaps teach at university level. Instead, she took whatever work provided stable income and raised 2 traumatized boys. That evening marked a subtle shift in the household atmosphere. Thomas joined her for dinner at a reasonable hour rather than working until late night. They sat at adjacent places rather than opposite ends of the massive table. Conversation remained careful and limited, but the hostile silence had transformed into something more comfortable. After dinner, Natalia followed her usual routine of walking in the garden before bed. The grounds featured beautiful landscaping, with paths winding through roses, lavender, and ornamental trees. What Thomas did not know was that Natalia sang during these walks. Her voice had always been her refuge, her way of processing emotions too complicated for words. She sang old folk songs her mother taught her, contemporary pieces she loved, sometimes improvised melodies that matched her mood. The garden acoustics carried her voice beautifully, and singing there made her feel less alone in this enormous empty house. Hidden listener. Thomas discovered her singing by accident 3 nights later. He had been working in his study when he heard something extraordinary floating through his open window. A female voice, rich and pure, singing a haunting melody he did not recognize. He moved to the window and looked down at the garden. Natalia walked slowly along the stone path, her head tilted back slightly, singing to the stars. Her voice carried emotion that words alone could never express. Joy and sorrow, hope and grief, all woven together in sound. He stood frozen, listening. Something cracked inside the carefully constructed walls around his heart. Rebecca used to play piano in the evenings, filling their home with music. After she died, Thomas had eliminated all music from his life. Silence felt safer, less painful. But Natalia's voice reached past his defenses, reminding him that beauty still existed in the world. He found himself returning to that window night after night, listening to her sing, never revealing his presence. The 4th night, she sang something that nearly broke him, a simple love song about finding light in darkness, about hearts learning to heal. Her voice wavered slightly on certain phrases, suggesting the words meant something personal. Thomas gripped the window frame, fighting unexpected tears. He had not cried since Rebecca's funeral. He had locked all emotion away because feeling anything hurt too much. But this woman's voice was reaching the frozen places inside him, thawing ice he thought was permanent. The charity gala, 2 weeks later, a business crisis forced them to attend the Wellington Foundation's annual charity gala together. The event raised money for pediatric hospitals, something Rebecca had championed. Thomas had avoided it last year, but Vincent Shaw was using his absence to gain influence with board members. Appearing with his new wife would demonstrate stability and counter Vincent's manipulations. Natalia felt nervous about the event. She owned nothing appropriate for such occasions. Thomas arranged for a personal stylist to help her, insisting it was necessary for appearances. The night of the gala, Natalia descended the mansion's grand staircase wearing a midnight blue gown that the stylist selected. Her hair was styled in an elegant twist, minimal jewelry at her throat and ears. Thomas waited at the bottom of the stairs, and she watched his eyes widen slightly before his expression returned to neutral. He told her she looked presentable. Natalia bit back a sarcastic response and simply thanked him. The gala was held at the Four Seasons, the ballroom glittering with crystal chandeliers and wealthy donors in expensive formal wear. Natalia felt completely out of place among women wearing jewelry worth more than her childhood home. Thomas kept his hand at the small of her back as they navigated through clusters of guests. He introduced her repeatedly, his voice carrying no warmth but also no embarrassment. She was simply his wife, a fact stated without elaboration. Vincent Shaw approached them near the silent auction tables. He was a tall man with silver hair and calculating gray eyes. His smile held no genuine warmth as he greeted Thomas and turned his attention to Natalia. He mentioned hearing about the sudden marriage and expressed curiosity about where Thomas had found her. Before Thomas could respond, Vincent continued with practiced cruelty. He asked if she was a nurse or something similar at the facility where Victoria was staying. He suggested it must be quite a change living in the Wellington estate compared to whatever modest circumstances she came from. Natalia felt blood rush to her cheeks. Other guests nearby turned to listen, sensing drama. Vincent's wife, a thin woman dripping with diamonds, smiled with malicious amusement. Thomas's hand tightened at Natalia's back. His voice, when he spoke, carried steel underneath professional courtesy. He told Vincent that Natalia was a voice therapist who helped people recover from trauma. She possessed skills Vincent could never comprehend, like compassion and genuine care for others. Thomas suggested Vincent focus on his own concerns, rather than gossiping like someone with too much time and too little purpose. The surrounding guests fell silent. Vincent's smile faltered. His wife looked shocked. Thomas guided Natalia away, before Vincent could respond, moving them toward the bar. Natalia felt shaken by the unexpected defense. She whispered that he did not need to do that. Thomas ordered them both drinks and told her firmly that Vincent was a parasite who fed on others' discomfort. He would not allow Vincent to disrespect her publicly. Whatever their private arrangement, in public, she was his wife. That meant something. Victoria's final days. They received the call at 2 a.m. 3 days later. Victoria had been rushed to intensive care. Her weakened body was failing faster than doctors expected. Thomas and Natalia dressed quickly and drove through empty Seattle streets to the hospital. They found Victoria barely conscious, machines breathing for her, monitors tracking her fading vital signs. Thomas sat beside the bed, holding his mother's hand, his face finally showing the grief he usually hid so carefully. Natalia stood near, the window giving them space for goodbye. But Victoria's eyes found her, and with tremendous effort, she gestured for Natalia to come closer. Natalia approached the bedside and took Victoria's other hand. Victoria's voice came out barely audible, through the oxygen mask. She thanked Natalia for giving her hope that Thomas might learn to live again. She made Natalia promise to keep singing, to never let grief silence the beauty she carried inside. She told Thomas to listen carefully to what Natalia's voice could, teach him about healing. Victoria died peacefully near dawn with both of them present. Thomas sat motionless, staring at his mother's still face. Natalia did not think. She simply moved beside him and wrapped her arms around his rigid shoulders. For a moment he remained frozen. Then something broke. His arms came around her waist, and he buried his face against her shoulder. Silent sobs shook his body. Natalia held him tightly, one hand stroking his hair, whispering that she had him, that he was not alone, that grief was love with nowhere to go. They stayed that way until the nurses came to respectfully begin final procedures. The days following Victoria's death blurred together in a haze of funeral arrangements, legal meetings, and endless condolence calls. Thomas moved through these. Obligations with mechanical efficiency, his emotions locked away again behind professional walls. But Natalia noticed the small cracks in his armor, the way his hands trembled slightly when signing documents, how he stood alone in Victoria's hospital room after they cleared her belongings, staring at the empty bed, the untouched meals that Mrs. Patterson worried over. Natalia found herself stepping into spaces she had previously avoided. She answered phone calls from distant relatives, coordinated with the funeral home, ensured that flowers were arranged properly. Mason and Oliver came to the mansion after school, and their youthful energy brought unexpected life to the somber atmosphere. Thomas watched them with something almost like curiosity, as if he had forgotten that joy could exist alongside sorrow. Oliver showed him a drawing he made in art class, and Thomas studied it seriously, offering genuine praise that made the boy beam. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday morning at St. Mark's Cathedral. Hundreds attended, filling the vast space, with whispered conversations and rustling programs. Business associates, society friends, charity organizations Victoria had supported all came to pay respects. Natalia sat beside Thomas in the front row, feeling the weight of curious stares. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, no jewelry except her wedding band. Thomas sat rigid beside her, his face carved from stone. Vincent's attack during. The reception at the Wellington estate afterward, Vincent Shaw made his move. He approached Thomas in the study where he had retreated briefly from the crowds. Natalia was searching for him when she heard raised voices through the partially open door. Vincent was saying that with Victoria gone, the board would demand leadership, changes. Thomas's recent marriage fooled no one. Everyone knew it was a desperate arrangement to satisfy his mother's conditions. Vincent suggested Thomas step aside gracefully and accept a consulting position, while someone more stable took control. Natalia pushed the door open fully. Both men turned to look at her. She walked directly to Thomas and took his hand, feeling him stiffen with surprise. She told Vincent that his timing was remarkably tasteless, attacking someone at their mother's funeral. She suggested he leave before embarrassing himself further. Vincent's eyes narrowed. He asked what she possibly understood about business or leadership. She was a nurse who married into money. Natalia smiled coldly. She corrected him that she was a voice therapist, which meant she understood communication better than most. She could hear the desperation in his voice, the fear underneath his bravado. She told Vincent that Thomas had built innovations Vincent could never imagine. The company thrived because of Thomas's vision, not despite his grief. She stated clearly that she stood with her husband completely. If Vincent wanted a fight, he would get one. Thomas squeezed her hand, his expression unreadable. Vincent looked, between them recalculating. He muttered something about discussing this later and left. The moment the door closed, Thomas turned to Natalia with surprise clear on his face. He asked why she defended him. She met his gaze steadily and told him that despite their arrangement, she did not tolerate bullies. Vincent was trying to steal. What Victoria wanted protected. That made it personal. Unexpected alliance. The following week, they fell into an unexpected partnership. Thomas needed to shore up board support, and Natalia accompanied him to dinners and meetings. She surprised him repeatedly with her ability to read people, her quiet observations about who could be trusted and who harbored hidden agendas. One evening, after a particularly challenging dinner with skeptical investors, Thomas poured them both wine in his study. He admitted that he had underestimated her completely. She was far more perceptive than he realized. Natalia accepted the wine and settled into the leather chair across from his desk. She told him that growing up poor taught valuable lessons about reading people. When you had little, you learned quickly who wanted to help and who wanted to exploit. Thomas studied her with genuine interest for perhaps the first time. He asked about her childhood. Natalia hesitated, then began sharing. Her father worked construction. Her mother cleaned houses. They never had extra money, but her parents loved fiercely. They encouraged her singing, drove hours to watch her school performances, believed she could achieve anything. After they died, the reality crushed those dreams. She was 22 with two traumatized 12-year-olds depending on her. Student loans she could not afford, jobs that barely covered rent. She took the voice therapy position because it paid better than teaching music. She worked extra shifts, skipped meals, wore secondhand clothes. Mason and Oliver never knew how close they came to losing their home multiple times. Thomas listened without interrupting, something shifting in how he looked at her. He said quietly that she sacrificed everything for her brothers. She shook her head. She gave up some things but gained the privilege of watching them grow into good young men. That mattered more than any career. The rainstorm confession. 2 nights later, a fierce storm rolled in from the Pacific. Rain battered the mansion windows, wind howling through the trees. Natalia could not sleep, restless with thoughts she had been avoiding. She wandered downstairs near midnight, intending to make tea. Instead, she found Thomas standing in the darkened sunroom, watching lightning illuminate the garden. He held a glass of whiskey, still wearing his dress shirt and slacks. From dinner, tie discarded somewhere. He did not turn when she entered, but spoke into the darkness. He told her that Rebecca died on a night like this. They had been arguing that morning about something stupid, whether to renovate the kitchen. He left for work angry, did not kiss her goodbye. When she collapsed that afternoon, His last words to her had been irritated and dismissive. He never got to tell her he was sorry, that he loved her, that nothing mattered except her. The guilt ate at him every single day. Natalia moved beside him, watching rain stream down the glass. She said softly that Rebecca knew he loved her. One morning argument could not erase 8 years of devotion. Grief distorted memories, made us punish ourselves for being human. Thomas turned to look at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He asked how she managed it, carrying responsibility for her brothers while grieving her parents. How did she not collapse under that weight? Natalia smiled sadly. She told him she did collapse, multiple times. She cried in grocery store parking lots, screamed into pillows, questioned everything. But Mason and Oliver needed her functional, so she learned to carry grief while still moving forward. Walls fall down. Thomas set down his glass and did something unexpected. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. He told her she was remarkable, far stronger than he ever was. Natalia's breath caught. She admitted that he was wrong. She was not strong. She was terrified, constantly. Terrified she would fail her brothers. Terrified this marriage arrangement would end and she would lose the security they finally had. Terrified that she was starting to care about him in ways that were not part of their agreement. The confession hung between them. Thomas stared at her, his hand still against her face. He whispered that he was terrified too. Terrified that feeling anything for her betrayed Rebecca's memory. Terrified that opening his heart again meant risking that unbearable pain. Terrified that when their year ended, he would miss her singing in the garden, her quiet presence. The way she made this empty house feel like it might someday be a home. Lightning flashed, illuminating them both. Thomas leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. Natalia did not move. Their lips met softly, tentatively, a question more than a demand. Then the kiss deepened, months of loneliness and carefully maintained distance dissolving. His arms came around her waist, pulling her close. Her hands slid into his hair. The kiss tasted like whiskey and rain and possibility. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. He told her he was sorry for being so cold, for treating her like an inconvenience, rather than a person who deserved kindness. The investigation, Natalia, was about to respond when Thomas's phone buzzed urgently. He glanced at it and his expression hardened. Vincent had called an emergency board meeting for Monday morning, claiming he had evidence that Thomas's marriage was fraudulent. Someone had been investigating Natalia's background, the timing of their meeting, the circumstances of their wedding. Vincent planned to present this information and demand Thomas's immediate removal. The tender moment shattered. Thomas began pacing, his mind already strategizing. Natalia felt cold wash over her. She had known this was temporary, that reality would eventually intrude. She told Thomas she would leave quietly, release him from the arrangement. It would be simpler that way. Thomas stopped and looked at her with intensity that made her heart race. He asked if she wanted to leave. Natalia hesitated, then admitted honestly that she did not want to go. Somewhere along the way, this had stopped being just an arrangement. She cared about him, about what happened to the company Victoria wanted, protected. Thomas crossed the room and took her hands. He told her they would face Vincent together. He was done pretending this marriage meant nothing. Maybe it started as a business arrangement, but it had become something real. If she was willing, he wanted to fight for them, for whatever this was becoming. Natalia searched his face, looking for certainty. She asked, what about Rebecca? What about his vow to never love again? Thomas smiled sadly. Rebecca would have hated watching him waste years in grief. She believed in living fully, in taking chances. Natalia's voice, her presence, had reminded him how to feel again. That was not betrayal. That was healing. Standing together, Monday morning arrived cold and bright. Thomas and Natalia dressed carefully for the board meeting, armor for corporate battle. In the car ride downtown, Thomas held her hand tightly. He told her that whatever happened, he wanted her to know something. This year with her, even with all its complications, had given him more peace than the previous 2 years of isolation. She had brought music back into his life, literally and figuratively. He was grateful for that, regardless of what the board decided. The conference room was filled with stern-faced board members when they arrived. Vincent sat at the head of the table, looking confident. He had prepared an extensive presentation about Natalia's background, the rushed wedding, the convenient timing with Victoria's changed will. He suggested Thomas had manipulated his dying mother and married a gold digger to secure his inheritance. The accusations hung in the air like poison. Thomas stood, his voice calm and commanding. He did not deny the arrangement's origins. Yes, his mother suggested the marriage. Yes, there were practical reasons initially, but he would not apologize for honoring his mother's wishes or for finding unexpected happiness in the process. He explained that Natalia had asked for nothing except security for her brothers. She worked at the medical center by choice, volunteered her time, lived modestly despite access to his wealth. She was the opposite of what Vincent suggested. The truth. Revealed, then Natalia stood, surprising everyone, including Thomas. Her voice was steady and clear as she addressed the room. She told them she understood their concerns. From outside, this marriage looked suspicious, but she wanted them to understand something about sacrifice and love. She explained about her parents, about raising her brothers, about the impossible choices poverty forced. Victoria had offered an arrangement that helped everyone involved. Natalia had agreed not out of greed, but out of desperate love for her family. She continued, her voice growing stronger. Over these months, she had watched Thomas struggle with grief while trying to honor his father's legacy. She had seen his brilliance, his integrity, his capacity for kindness underneath the walls he built. She had witnessed him slowly remember how to smile, how to engage with life again. If the board wanted to punish him for finding a path forward through grief, that spoke more about them than about him. She told them plainly that she loved Thomas Wellington, and that love was not fake or manufactured. It had grown from respect, from shared loss, from recognizing a good man trapped in pain. The room fell silent. Vincent's confident expression faltered. One of the older board members, a woman named Margaret Chen, who had worked with Thomas's father, spoke up. She said that watching Thomas these past months, seeing him engage again with the company and with life, had been encouraging. Whatever the marriage's origins, the results spoke clearly. Thomas had stabilized, refocused, led the company through challenging times. She moved to table Vincent's motion and reaffirm support for Thomas's leadership. Vincent's betrayal exposed before. Anyone could second the motion. Thomas's assistant burst into the room with urgent documents. A financial audit he had quietly ordered revealed that Vincent had been embezzling company funds for years, hiding the theft through complex shell corporations. The evidence was irrefutable. Vincent had been planning to pin the missing money on Thomas once he gained control. His attack on Thomas's marriage was desperate misdirection. Security was already waiting outside to escort Vincent out. His career was finished, criminal charges pending. Vincent's face went pale, then red with rage. He started shouting accusations, but security removed him from the building. The board sat in stunned silence. Margaret looked at Thomas with new respect. She told him his father would be proud, both of how he protected the company and how he found his way back to living. The board voted unanimously to support his continued leadership and to formally welcome Natalia as part of the Wellington family. New beginnings. That evening, Thomas and Natalia stood in the mansion garden where she used to sing alone. He told her their contract year would end next month. He had prepared divorce papers as originally agreed. Then he dropped to one knee, pulling a ring box from his pocket. He said those papers would remain unsigned unless she wanted out, because he was asking her properly this time, with no contracts or arrangements. He loved her. He wanted to build a real marriage, a real life together. Would she stay? Not as a business partner, but as his true wife. Natalia looked down at him, tears streaming down her face. She told him yes, 1,000 times yes. Thomas slipped a beautiful diamond ring onto her finger beside the simple band from their courthouse wedding. They kissed in the garden while evening stars appeared overhead. Later, they called Mason and Oliver to share the news. The boys were thrilled, having grown fond of Thomas and his willingness to attend their school events. 12 months later, Natalia stood in the mansion's music room, her hands resting on her swollen belly. She was 6 months pregnant with their daughter. Thomas had converted an entire wing into a music therapy center where she taught classes and worked with patients. The house filled regularly with sound now, laughter and conversation, and always music. Rebecca's portrait remained in the West Wing, honored but no longer a shrine. Thomas had learned that loving again did not diminish what came before. Mason was thriving at university, studying engineering as he always dreamed. Oliver had been accepted into an prestigious art program. They visited every weekend, filling the house with youthful energy. Thomas had discovered he enjoyed being an older brother figure, offering guidance while learning from their fresh perspectives. The company had reached new heights under his renewed leadership, innovations emerging from his re-engaged creativity. That evening, Natalia sang in the garden as always. But now, Thomas stood beside her, his arms around her waist. Their daughter, moving inside her. He had learned the words to her favorite songs. They sang together under the stars, two broken people who found healing in each other's company. Love had found them when neither was looking, proving that hearts could mend and second chances existed for those brave enough to risk feeling again. Victoria had been right all along. Sometimes the most unexpected arrangements lead to the most beautiful destinations.